Cold War did not look like what most people were told it looked like. The textbooks described it as a rivalry, a standoff, a geopolitical chess match conducted at a distance by men in suits who understood the rules. The reality was something closer to a slow administrative collapse, held together by paperwork, protocol, and an almost theological faith in the idea that no one would actually press the button. That faith was tested more times than any government ever admitted. And the margin between civilization and the end of it was, on several occasions, measured not in political resolve, but in the hesitation of a single officer, the malfunction of a single censor, the delay of a single telegram. What follows is not a dramatization, it is an accounting. A record of what was hidden, what was sealed, what was quietly removed from the public record for decades until it could no longer be denied. Some of these facts were declassified by accident. Some were released under legal pressure. Some emerged only because the men who witnessed them grew old and decided that silence was no longer worth the effort. None of them were taught in schools while they were happening. None of them appeared in newspapers. And most of the systems they describe are still, in one form or another, operational. The standard framing of the Cold War places its beginning in 1947 and its end in 1991. Those dates are administratively convenient. They mark the announcement of the Truman Doctrine and the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union. But the war, if it can be called that, was never declared, never officially named as it was occurring, and never truly concluded in any operational sense. The weapons remained. The targeting plans remained. The command structures remained. What ended in 1991 was the political framework that justified them, not the machinery itself. The machinery simply changed ownership and updated its threat assessments. To understand what the public was not told, it helps to begin not at the beginning, but at one of the moments when the entire structure nearly came apart. The year was 1983. The month was September. The Soviet Union's early warning satellite system registered what its algorithms interpreted as the launch of 5 American intercontinental ballistic missiles. The system was called OCO, which translates roughly as eye. It had been designed to detect the thermal signature of missile launches from American soil, and on the night of September 26th, it believed it had done exactly that. The duty officer at the Soviet Missile Warning Center outside Moscow was a lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov. His orders were clear. If the system reported a launch, he was to report it upward through the chain of command. The protocols then in place would have triggered a retaliatory launch before the incoming missiles could destroy the Soviet command infrastructure. The entire logic of mutual assured destruction rested on this kind of automatic time-compressed response. There was, by design, almost no room for hesitation. Petrov hesitated. He looked at the readout, which showed 5 missiles, not hundreds, and decided that a genuine American first strike would not consist of 5 missiles. A genuine first strike would be overwhelming, designed to destroy Soviet capacity before a response could be organized. 5 missiles made no military sense. He also noted that the ground-based radar systems had not confirmed the satellite's detection. He picked up the phone and reported the alarm as a system malfunction. He was correct. The satellites had been confused by sunlight reflecting off clouds over the American Midwest, in a particular atmospheric configuration that the system's designers had not anticipated. The missiles did not exist. The launch had not happened. But for several minutes, the Soviet military's automated response system had been on the threshold of initiating a counterstrike that would have killed tens of millions of people based on a technical misreading of reflected sunlight. Petrov was neither celebrated nor punished in any formal sense. He was quietly transferred to a less sensitive position. He later described being reprimanded, not for making the wrong call, but for failing to properly document his actions in the duty log during the incident. The event was classified. It did not become known in the West until 1998, 15 years later, when a retired Soviet general mentioned it in a memoir. The Soviet government never officially acknowledged it. The Russian government, which inherited the relevant files, confirmed certain details only decades after that. The system that nearly launched a nuclear war over reflected sunlight remained in service, in modified form, for years after the incident. What makes Petrov's story particularly important is not the drama of the moment, but what it reveals about the underlying architecture. The Soviet early warning system was not designed with significant room for human judgment. It was designed for speed. The assumption embedded in the system's logic was that any American launch would have to be answered within minutes, before the incoming missiles could destroy the Soviet leadership and eliminate the possibility of any response. This assumption was shared, in mirror form, by the American system. Both sides had engineered their nuclear arsenals and their command infrastructures around the premise that the only way to survive a first strike was to detect it within seconds of launch and respond before the missiles arrived. The human beings in the loop were not there to make decisions so much as to execute a predetermined sequence as fast as possible. Petrov broke that sequence. He slowed it down by inserting his own judgment where the system had not expected any to exist. And because he did, nothing happened. But the system itself was never redesigned to prevent the same situation from recurring. The 1983 incident was not the only time an automated system nearly ended the world by misreading its environment. A few weeks earlier, in the same year, the United States had conducted a NATO military exercise called Able Archer 83. The exercise was designed to simulate a coordinated NATO response to a Soviet conventional military attack, including the potential escalation to nuclear weapons. It was, in many respects, routine. NATO conducted exercises regularly, but Able Archer 83 was different in ways that the American and British intelligence communities did not fully understand until much later. The Soviet leadership, which had been operating under a program called Ryan, a Russian acronym for nuclear missile attack, had instructed its intelligence services to watch for specific indicators of an American first strike. The indicators included unusual military exercises, changes in communication patterns, the mobilization of reserve forces, and the movement of political leadership to protected command facilities. Able Archer 83 included several of these features. The KGB and Soviet military intelligence reported to Moscow that the exercise might not be an exercise. A small number of Soviet nuclear forces were placed on a heightened state of readiness. Aircraft in Eastern Europe were loaded with nuclear weapons and put on alert status. The Soviet leadership appears to have genuinely considered the possibility that Able Archer was the cover story for an actual attack. The American intelligence community did not learn the full extent of the Soviet response until a British double agent named Oleg Gordievsky provided a detailed account after defecting in 1985. When American officials reviewed Gordievsky's information, including the internal KGB reports he had smuggled out, some of them concluded that the world had come closer to nuclear war in November 1983 than at almost any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. A subsequent American intelligence assessment, produced in 1990 and partially declassified in 2015, concluded that the Soviet concerns had been genuine and that the risk had been real. President Reagan, when briefed on the assessment, reportedly expressed genuine surprise. He had not understood that Able Archer 83 had been read by the Soviets as a potential prelude to attack. The exercise had been conducted in good faith. The misreading had been, from the Soviet perspective, rational, given their assumptions about American intentions. The two systems, the American military exercise protocol and the Soviet early warning indicators, had interacted in a way that neither side had designed or anticipated. The near catastrophe had emerged not from aggression, but from the collision of two parallel bureaucracies, each operating according to its own internal logic, neither of which had accounted for how the other would interpret its behavior. The secrecy surrounding both the Petrov incident and the Able Archer crisis was not accidental. It reflected a deliberate institutional preference throughout the Cold War for managing nuclear risk through silence rather than disclosure. The reasoning, to the extent it was ever articulated, was roughly as follows. If the public understood how close the systems had come to catastrophic failure, the resulting political pressure might force changes that would undermine deterrence. The credibility of mutual assured destruction depended on both sides believing that the other's systems were reliable, decisive, and not subject to second-guessing. Admitting that the systems had misfired, that a lieutenant colonel in a bunker had unilaterally decided not to report what his equipment was telling him, would introduce a kind of uncertainty that the doctrine could not easily absorb. So the incidents were classified, the participants were reassigned, and the public was left with the impression that the Cold War was being managed by rational, careful, fully informed actors who had everything under control. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the one moment of Cold War nuclear danger that the public was told about while it was happening, is itself only partially understood even now. The version that entered the popular record emphasizes the 13 days of deliberation in Washington, the careful back-channel communications, the rational choice by both Kennedy and Khrushchev to step back from the edge. What the public record omitted for decades was a specific incident that occurred on October 27, 1962, at the height of the crisis. A Soviet submarine, designated B-59, was operating in the Atlantic near the quarantine line established by the American Navy. The submarine had been out of radio contact for days. Its crew did not know whether nuclear war had begun. The American ships above them were dropping signaling charges, which the submarine's crew initially interpreted as possible depth charges. The submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, concluded that war had started and ordered the preparation of the submarine's nuclear-armed torpedo. To fire the weapon, all three of the submarine's senior officers had to agree. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, agreed with the captain. The third officer, Vasily Arkhipov, who held the same rank as the captain and was also the flotilla commander on board, did not agree. He refused to authorize the launch. He argued, under considerable pressure, that they should surface and attempt to make radio contact with Moscow before taking any irreversible action. Eventually, after a period of argument that has never been precisely documented, his position prevailed. The submarine surfaced. The torpedo was not fired. The crisis continued, and then, eventually, resolved. Archipov's refusal was not publicly known until 2002, 40 years after the event, when Russian and American officials participating in a retrospective conference on the crisis exchanged accounts. The former American Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, who had been a key figure in the Kennedy administration's management of the crisis, said after hearing the account that the world had come closer to nuclear war than any of them had known. The incident illustrates something that becomes clear when the full Cold War record is eventually examined. The formal command systems were not the only thing standing between the world and catastrophe. The informal judgments of individual military officers, often acting without authorization, often under conditions of incomplete information, were also part of the barrier. Arkhipov did not refuse the launch because he had received instructions telling him to refuse. He refused because he concluded on his own that it was the wrong decision. The system had not been designed to depend on that kind of individual judgment. It happened anyway, and the outcome of the crisis, at least in that specific instance, depended on it. The American side of the Cuban Missile Crisis also contained information that was withheld from the public for decades. One of the least known elements involves the Jupiter missiles that the United States had deployed in Turkey. These missiles were, by 1962, technically obsolete. They were slow to launch, vulnerable to Soviet attack, and had been scheduled for removal. But their presence in Turkey, pointed at Soviet territory, was a significant factor in Soviet calculations. Khrushchev's decision to place Soviet missiles in Cuba was influenced, at least in part, by the perceived asymmetry of having American nuclear weapons stationed near Soviet borders, while the Soviet Union had no equivalent capability near American borders. The Kennedy administration eventually agreed, as part of the resolution of the crisis, to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey. This agreement was kept secret. Publicly, the resolution was presented as a simple Soviet capitulation in exchange for American assurances not to invade Cuba. The Turkish missile withdrawal, which was arguably the more significant concession, was not disclosed to the American public or to most of the American government. It was known only to a handful of officials. The full details were not publicly confirmed for more than 2 decades. The reasoning for the secrecy was, again, presented as practical. Disclosing the deal would have created problems with the NATO alliance. Turkey and other NATO members would have been alarmed by the suggestion that the United States had negotiated away their defensive assets without consultation. The domestic political cost would also have been significant. Kennedy's public posture throughout the crisis had been one of firm, uncompromising resistance to Soviet pressure. Revealing that the resolution had involved a secret American concession would have complicated that narrative. So the concession was hidden, the narrative was maintained, and the public was taught a version of the crisis that was, at minimum, significantly incomplete. The practice of managing the public record of nuclear events extended well beyond individual crises. The United States conducted a systematic program of denial regarding nuclear accidents for the first several decades of the Cold War. The Air Force and Navy experienced dozens of incidents involving nuclear weapons, including crashes, fires, jettisoning of weapons, and in several cases, the partial activation of nuclear arming systems. The government's standard response to any inquiry about these incidents was to neither confirm nor deny the presence of nuclear weapons at any given location, a policy known internally as neither confirm nor deny. This policy was not merely about operational security. It was also, in practice, a mechanism for preventing the public from understanding how often nuclear weapons were involved in accidents, how close some of those accidents had come to detonation, and what the consequences of an accidental nuclear detonation on American soil would have been. One of the most significant of these accidents occurred on January 24, 1961, near Goldsboro, North Carolina. A B-52 bomber carrying 2 Mark 39 nuclear bombs experienced a structural failure and broke apart in flight. Both bombs separated from the aircraft. One of them functioned in a manner that was, depending on the technical assessment consulted, uncomfortably close to a complete arming sequence. The bomb deployed its parachute, which was a system designed to slow its descent during an intentional drop. It activated several of its arming mechanisms in sequence. An investigation conducted by a nuclear weapons engineer named Parker Jones, whose report was partially declassified decades later, concluded that 3 of the 4 safety mechanisms on the bomb had failed. The 4th, a simple low-voltage switch, had remained in the safe position. The bomb did not detonate. But the conclusion of the report was not reassuring. It stated, in language that was at least partly redacted in the declassified version, that if the 4th switch had also failed, the United States would have suffered a nuclear explosion in its own territory. The Goldsboro incident was not publicly acknowledged in meaningful detail until 2013, when documents obtained under the Freedom of Information Act were released and reported by a journalist named Eric Schlosser, who had been researching nuclear weapons accidents for a book. The Air Force's initial response to the reporting was to describe the incident as having been managed safely and to emphasize that the bomb had not detonated. The safety record of the nuclear weapons program, the Air Force statement suggested, was exemplary. The internal documents told a different story. The story they told was not of exemplary safety, but of a weapons design that had relied, in at least this instance, on a single electrical component performing correctly under circumstances that no one had tested. The same pattern of internal candor and external denial appeared repeatedly across the Cold War nuclear program. A document produced by the Sandia National Laboratories in 1977, which was eventually declassified in the 1990s, assessed the safety of nuclear weapons and concluded that a significant number of accidents involving nuclear weapons had occurred in which the probability of detonation had been uncomfortably high. The document used technical language and probabilistic framing that was not designed for general audiences. Its essential content, translated into plain language, was that the weapons were not as safe as the public had been led to believe. The document was classified. Its conclusions were not reflected in any public communication from any American government body. The secrecy surrounding nuclear accidents was matched by secrecy surrounding the American and Soviet targeting plans. Both countries developed enormously detailed plans for nuclear strikes. On the American side, the primary planning document was called the Single Integrated Operational Plan, or SIOP. The SIOP was the Master Nuclear Strike Plan, developed and updated by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that specified which Soviet targets would be struck, in what order, with how many weapons, under what circumstances. The SIOP was, throughout most of the Cold War, classified at a level above top secret. Presidents were briefed on it, but the briefings were often general rather than specific. Some presidents, according to accounts that emerged decades later, expressed discomfort with what they were told. Dwight Eisenhower, who had been Supreme Allied Commander in Europe and was certainly not unfamiliar with large-scale military planning, was reportedly troubled by the scale of the PSYOP's target list and the projected civilian casualties. The plan that was presented to him called for the simultaneous destruction of the Soviet Union, China, and other aligned states. The projected death toll in the first hours of the plan's execution ran into the hundreds of millions. The PSYOP was not designed to be fought and won in any conventional sense. It was designed to ensure that any Soviet nuclear attack would be followed by a retaliatory strike so overwhelming that no rational actor could consider a first strike advantageous. The problem with this logic, which several analysts identified at the time but were unable to fully articulate within the classification system, was that it required the weapons to be used in a specific way. The plan was not flexible. It did not have a small strike option, at least not in its early versions. If the command authority decided to use nuclear weapons at all, the plan's logic pushed toward full employment. Partial use of the plan was difficult to coordinate and potentially left American forces in a compromised position. The PSYOP, in other words, had been designed as a deterrent, but functioned, when examined closely, as a mechanism that made any nuclear use enormously difficult to control. The civilian leadership's relationship with the PSYOP was complicated by the fact that the plan was maintained and updated by military planners who operated with significant autonomy. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had institutional reasons to favor comprehensive planning over flexible options. Large-scale planning justified large-scale procurement. The PSYOP's enormous target list justified an enormous arsenal. The arsenal justified a large and well-funded military establishment. These institutional incentives were not conspiracy. They were the normal operation of a bureaucracy serving its own perpetuation. But they meant that the nuclear war plan was shaped not only by strategic analysis, but by the institutional preferences of the organizations producing it. And since the plan was classified, the civilians who might have pushed back against its assumptions had limited access to the details that would have allowed them to do so effectively. The Soviet Union operated a parallel system with parallel problems. Soviet nuclear planning was, if anything, more centralized and less subject to civilian review than the American system. The Soviet military establishment had considerable autonomy in weapons development and deployment. Political oversight, while nominally present, was often conducted by officials who lacked the technical background to challenge the military's assessments. The result was an arsenal and a set of war plans that reflected military logic more than political calculation. The Soviet archives, which became partially accessible after 1991, revealed that the Soviet targeting plan for Western Europe was, in some respects, even more comprehensive than American officials had assumed. The plan called for strikes against a large number of targets in Western Europe, including cities and civilian infrastructure, under circumstances that were defined broadly enough to include scenarios that Western analysts had not considered particularly dangerous. One of the most disturbing revelations from the Soviet archives concerned the command and control system that the Soviet Union developed in the 1980s, which became known in the West as the Dead Hand System, or by its Russian designation, Perimeter. The system was designed to address a specific problem. What if an American first strike destroyed the Soviet leadership before it could order a retaliatory strike? The Dead Hand was the Soviet answer to this problem. It was an automated system that could, under certain conditions, launch a retaliatory strike without requiring authorization from any surviving human commander. The system monitored for nuclear explosions on Soviet territory. If it detected the kind of attack pattern that would suggest a decapitating first strike, and if it could not establish communication with the Soviet leadership, it would activate and authorize a retaliatory launch. The launch would be executed by a small number of officers at a hardened command facility who had no authority to prevent it. The Dead Hand system was not confirmed publicly until 1993, when a Russian journalist published an account based on interviews with former Soviet military officials. American officials acknowledged awareness of the system only gradually and with considerable reluctance. The system's existence raised a category of concern that the doctrine of mutual assured destruction had not fully accounted for. What if retaliation was automated? What if the deterrent worked not because rational leaders made calculated decisions, but because a machine had been programmed to treat any sufficiently large nuclear attack as authorization for a counterstrike? The stability that deterrence was supposed to provide depended in this scenario on no large-scale attack ever occurring, because if one did, the response was guaranteed, regardless of what any human being subsequently decided. The Dead Hand was, in a sense, the logical endpoint of the deterrence doctrine, a system specifically designed to remove human judgment from the most consequential decision in human history. The American response to the Dead Hand's existence, once it became known, was not to redesign the deterrence framework. It was, largely, to note the system's existence and continue with existing plans. There were internal debates about the implications, some of which have been partially declassified. The conclusions were, broadly, that the Dead Hand made deterrence more stable in some respects, because it guaranteed Soviet retaliation even if the leadership was destroyed, and less stable in others because it introduced an automated trigger that could, in principle, respond to a false alarm in the same way Petrov's system had nearly done. The debates did not result in any publicly announced policy change. They resulted in classified assessments that are still only partially available. The American Nuclear Command System also had components that were not publicly acknowledged. The Continuity of Government program, which was designed to ensure that some portion of the government could survive a nuclear attack and continue to function, was one of the most elaborately kept secrets of the Cold War. The program included the construction of hardened underground facilities at multiple locations, the pre-positioning of supplies and communications equipment, and the designation of a line of succession that extended far beyond the constitutional order in ways that were never publicly discussed. The most well-known of these facilities, the Greenbrier Bunker in West Virginia, was designed to house the Congress in the event of a nuclear attack. The facility's existence was not publicly confirmed until 1992, when a journalist named Ted Gupp published an account in the Washington Post. The facility had been in operation for more than 3 decades, serviced regularly by a small staff who lived and worked in the resort above it. Guests at the Greenbrier had been for decades a few floors away from a congressional shelter stocked with food, communications equipment, and decontamination facilities, with no knowledge that it existed. The Greenbrier facility's disclosure was notable not only for the specific secret it revealed, but for what it suggested about the broader continuity of government program. If a facility that large, that extensively staffed, that regularly maintained, had remained secret for 30 years, what else existed that had not been disclosed? The answer, which emerged gradually through a combination of investigative journalism, freedom of information requests, and eventual government acknowledgement, was quite a lot. There were facilities for the executive branch, for the military command authority, for the Federal Reserve, and for a range of other government functions. There were communication systems, transportation assets, and stockpiles of resources that had been quietly maintained for decades against the possibility of a nuclear attack that would require the government to operate from underground bunkers, while the surface of the country was, in the planning assumptions, largely uninhabitable. The planning for nuclear war's aftermath was itself a subject of considerable secrecy. The Federal Emergency Management Agency and its predecessors maintained plans for post-nuclear governance that included provisions for the suspension of ordinary civil authority, the establishment of military control over surviving populations, and the prioritization of certain resources and personnel. These plans were classified. They were developed by planners who operated on assumptions about nuclear war's effects that were, in some cases, more pessimistic than the publicly available civil defense literature suggested. The public-facing civil defense programs, with their duck and cover instructions and their advice about basement shelters, were not based on the same assumptions that the classified planners were working with. The classified planning assumed that a large-scale nuclear exchange would kill tens of millions of Americans in the first hours, destroy much of the country's infrastructure, and produce a radiation environment that would make large portions of the country uninhabitable for extended periods. The public messaging did not reflect this assumption, because the political decision had been made that panic was more dangerous than ignorance. The decision to prioritize administrative calm over public truthfulness extended to the question of nuclear fallout. The United States conducted extensive nuclear testing in the 1940s and 1950s, including tests at sites in the Pacific and at the Nevada test site. The testing produced significant amounts of radioactive fallout, some of which traveled across the American continent. The government's public position throughout this period was that the testing was conducted safely and that the fallout did not pose a significant public health risk. The internal position was considerably different. Documents that have been declassified over the decades reveal that government scientists understood in considerable detail the health risks associated with radioactive fallout, including increased rates of thyroid cancer, leukemia, and other conditions. This understanding was not systematically shared with the public. Communities downwind of the Nevada test site in Utah, Nevada, and Arizona were exposed to fallout from atmospheric tests without being given the information that would have allowed them to make informed choices about how to respond. The communities that were most heavily affected came to be known as downwinders. Their health outcomes, documented in studies conducted decades later, were consistent with significant radiation exposure. The government's acknowledgement of the health effects was slow, contested, and partial. The same pattern of internal knowledge and public silence characterized the testing in the Pacific. The Castle Bravo test, conducted in March 1954 at Bikini Atoll, produced an explosion far larger than the designers had predicted. The yield was approximately 15 megatons, roughly 2.5 times the expected yield, making it the largest nuclear detonation ever conducted by the United States. The fallout from the explosion was carried by winds over a much larger area than the safety exclusion zone had been designed to cover. A Japanese fishing vessel called the Lucky Dragon No. 5 was approximately 90 miles from the explosion outside the exclusion zone and was heavily contaminated by fallout. The crew suffered acute radiation sickness. One crew member died several months later. The incident became an international diplomatic problem and contributed significantly to the anti-nuclear testing movement in Japan and elsewhere. What was not disclosed at the time, and was not fully acknowledged for decades, was the extent of the fallout's reach. The Marshall Islands, which had been used as a testing ground, were affected by fallout in ways that caused serious long-term health consequences for the indigenous population. The residents of Rongelap Atoll, who were not within the designated exclusion zone, were exposed to significant fallout from Castle Bravo. American officials evacuated them several days after the test, not immediately. The residents were later returned to Rongelap by American authorities, who subsequently determined that the island was not safe for habitation. The residents were eventually evacuated again, years later, largely through their own initiative, after American officials had again told them the island was safe. The full extent of the health consequences for the Marshall Islands population was studied in classified programs for years. The conclusions of some of those studies were not shared with the affected population. The compensation provided to the affected communities, which was eventually authorized by Congress, was contested for decades and was, by most independent assessments, insufficient. The testing programs and their consequences were part of a broader pattern in which the development and maintenance of nuclear weapons imposed costs on specific populations that were not disclosed publicly, were not consented to by the affected communities, and were actively concealed by government authorities who understood the risks better than they acknowledged. The communities near nuclear weapons production facilities were another category of affected population. The Hanford site in Washington state, which produced plutonium for nuclear weapons, released radioactive materials into the surrounding environment over an extended period. The releases were, in some cases, deliberate. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, scientists at Hanford conducted what were called green run experiments, in which radioactive material was deliberately released into the atmosphere to test detection equipment. The experiments were classified. The nearby population was not informed. The communities in Washington and Oregon that were downwind were exposed to radioactive iodine and other materials without any warning or protective guidance. The Green Run experiments were not publicly acknowledged until 1986, when investigative journalists obtained documents through Freedom of Information requests. The government's initial response was to describe the experiments as a routine part of the weapons development program, and to emphasize that the releases had been within safety parameters. The subsequent history of regulatory and legal disputes over Hanford's environmental contamination, which continues to the present day, makes clear that the government's assessment of what constituted acceptable safety parameters was not one that the affected communities would have endorsed had they been consulted. The nuclear weapons production complex that the United States maintained throughout the Cold War was, in size and geographic extent, something that the public was not fully aware of. It included facilities in Washington, Tennessee, South Carolina, Colorado, Texas, Ohio, Missouri, and other states. These facilities produced the fissile materials, assembled the weapons, tested the components, and managed the waste from every stage of the process. The waste management was, throughout most of the Cold War, conducted according to standards that were later revised significantly downward in terms of what was considered acceptable. Contamination at numerous sites was, by the time it was publicly acknowledged, extensive and in many cases irreversible. The Savannah River site in South Carolina, the Rocky Flats plant in Colorado, the Fernald site in Ohio, and many others became subjects of environmental cleanup programs that stretched over decades and cost billions of dollars. The communities near these sites learned of the contamination gradually through a combination of investigative reporting, government disclosure, and the observable health consequences in their populations. Rocky Flats deserves particular attention. The facility, located approximately 16 miles from Denver, Colorado, produced plutonium triggers for nuclear weapons from 1952 until 1989. During that period, it experienced two significant fires, in 1957 and 1969, that released plutonium into the surrounding environment. It also managed its waste in ways that resulted in contamination of the soil and groundwater. The 1957 fire was not publicly disclosed at the time. The 1969 fire was more difficult to conceal because it was larger and produced visible effects. But the extent of the radioactive contamination it generated was not publicly acknowledged in full. The facility was shut down in 1989 following an FBI raid conducted by agents who had concluded that the facility's operators had been illegally disposing of radioactive waste. The raid itself was remarkable. It was the first time that federal agents had raided a nuclear weapons production facility. The subsequent investigation and cleanup revealed contamination far more extensive than had been publicly acknowledged. The site was eventually converted into a wildlife refuge, which remains one of the more unusual outcomes in the history of Cold War infrastructure. The contamination of nuclear weapons sites was matched, on the other side of the Cold War, by contamination that was arguably far worse. The Soviet nuclear weapons complex operated under even less public oversight and with even less regard for the environmental consequences of its activities. The Mayak facility in the southern Urals, which was the Soviet equivalent of Hanford and other American production sites, experienced a series of disasters that were classified for decades. The most significant was the Kishtim disaster of 1957, in which a tank containing radioactive waste exploded and released a large quantity of radioactive material into the surrounding region. The explosion contaminated an area of several hundred square kilometers. The Soviet government evacuated some of the affected population, but not immediately and not completely. The contamination was concealed from the public and from the international community for more than 3 decades. The disaster became known in the West primarily through the work of a Soviet scientist named Boris Medvedev, who published an account in 1976 based on information that had reached him through unofficial channels. The Soviet government initially denied that any such disaster had occurred, describing Medvedev's account as anti-Soviet propaganda. Western intelligence agencies, some of which had indirect evidence of the event, did not publicly confirm its occurrence. The full extent of the disaster was not officially acknowledged by Russian authorities until the post-Soviet period. The Mayak facility also practiced a routine of discharging radioactive waste into the Techa River, which was used by local communities for drinking water and agriculture. The practice continued for years. The health consequences for the communities along the river were documented in classified Soviet studies that were not accessible to the affected population. The practice of discharging waste into the Techa was eventually discontinued, but not before the river and the communities along it had been contaminated in ways that produced measurable health effects for generations. Lake Karachay, also at the Mayak facility, was used as an open-air dumping site for liquid radioactive waste for decades. By some estimates, the lake became one of the most radioactively contaminated places on Earth. Standing on the shore of the lake for a short period was sufficient to receive a radiation dose that would result in death within weeks. The lake's existence and its contamination were classified. Soviet workers at the facility who were aware of its condition were not in a position to report it publicly. The contamination began to spread when drought conditions in the 1960s caused the lake's level to drop and exposed contaminated sediment, which was then blown by wind across the surrounding area. An estimated 500,000 people were exposed to radioactive dust from this event. The Soviet government's response, as far as can be determined from documents that have become available since 1991, was primarily to classify the existing information more thoroughly. The environmental consequences of the Cold War's nuclear weapons programs were not limited to the production sites. The testing programs left contamination at multiple locations. The Marshall Islands, where the United States conducted 67 nuclear tests between 1946 and 1958, remain contaminated to a degree that affects the habitability of some atolls. The Soviet test site at Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan, where more than 400 nuclear tests were conducted, left contamination that affected the health of the surrounding population for generations. The communities near Semipalatinsk experienced elevated rates of cancer, birth defects, and other conditions associated with radiation exposure. The Soviet government was aware of these effects from studies conducted by its own health authorities, which were classified. The affected population was not informed of the risks and was not given protective guidance. The Semipalatinsk test site produced one of the more remarkable examples of Cold War institutional silence. Soviet scientists who studied the health effects of the testing on the local population were not permitted to publish their findings. Their data was classified. Some of them retained their data and eventually, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, contributed it to international studies that documented the health consequences of the testing program. The studies confirmed what the classified data had indicated, that the population near Semipalatinsk had been significantly harmed by the testing and that the harm had been known to Soviet authorities for decades. The nuclear weapons testing programs of both superpowers were, in addition to their direct effects, part of a broader escalation dynamic that each side monitored and responded to. Each test by one side was analyzed by the other as a potential indicator of new capabilities or new doctrinal priorities. The testing data that each side gathered from the other's tests was used to update targeting plans, adjust deterrence calculations, and justify new weapons development programs. The testing was not only a technical activity, it was also a form of communication, a demonstration of capability conducted in a register that both sides understood, but that was not explained to the public in those terms. The communication between the superpowers during the Cold War was, in fact, considerably more extensive and more informal than the public record suggested. The diplomatic channel that was most publicly known, the hotline established after the Cuban Missile Crisis, was only one of many conduits through which information was exchanged. Intelligence agencies on both sides maintained contacts and conducted operations that, by their nature, could not be publicly acknowledged. Some of these operations were designed to gather information, others were designed to shape the other side's perception, and some of them, the full extent of which became known only after the Cold War ended, were designed to prevent specific kinds of miscalculation. One of the most significant of these informal arrangements was the relationship between American and Soviet intelligence services around the management of nuclear risk. There were periods during the Cold War when both sides communicated, through indirect channels, information about their own capabilities and intentions that was designed to reduce the probability of miscalculation. These communications were not treaty obligations. They were not publicly announced. They were, in some cases, conducted through intermediaries who maintained plausible deniability for both sides. The arrangements that governed some aspects of this informal communication were not publicly acknowledged until decades after they had been in operation. The American intelligence community's understanding of Soviet capabilities was, for most of the Cold War, significantly incomplete. The intelligence assessments that drove American defense planning and nuclear weapons procurement were not always based on accurate information about what the Soviet Union actually had. In some periods, American intelligence significantly overestimated Soviet capabilities. In others, it underestimated them. The overestimates drove procurement programs that built more weapons than the actual Soviet threat required. The underestimates created periods of genuine concern about vulnerability that later proved to be based on incorrect intelligence. Both the overestimates and the underestimates were, in their time, classified information that informed policy decisions. The corrections, when they came, were also classified. The public understanding of Soviet capabilities, which was shaped by whatever information the government chose to release, was consistently inaccurate in one direction or another. The missile gap of the late 1950s and early 1960s is the most publicly known example of American intelligence overestimating Soviet capabilities. The gap referred to a perceived Soviet advantage in intercontinental ballistic missiles, which American intelligence had assessed, based on incomplete information, to be much larger than it actually was. The gap became a political issue in the 1960 presidential campaign, with John Kennedy attacking the Eisenhower administration for allowing the gap to develop. After the election, improved intelligence, partly from satellite reconnaissance, revealed that the gap was in the other direction. The United States had a significant advantage in deployed intercontinental ballistic missiles. The corrected assessment was classified. The political debate about the gap had already had its effect on procurement and policy, resulting in American missile programs that were justified by a threat that did not, in the form that had been described, actually exist. The satellite reconnaissance program that provided the corrected assessment was itself one of the most significant secrets of the early Cold War. The Corona program, which used photographic reconnaissance satellites to image Soviet territory, was classified at the highest levels. Its existence was not publicly acknowledged until 1995. For the 3 decades during which it operated, the program produced intelligence that fundamentally shaped American understanding of Soviet capabilities and intentions. The satellites photographed Soviet missile sites, military installations, naval facilities, and industrial complexes in detail that no other intelligence source could match. They also, in the process, revealed that many of the assessments that had driven Cold War planning were inaccurate. The Soviet bomber threat of the mid-1950s, which had driven a massive American investment in air defense, turned out to be significantly smaller than had been believed. The Soviet missile capability, when imaged directly, was different in character from what the intelligence community had assessed. The corrections informed by satellite imagery were incorporated into classified planning but were not reflected in public statements, which continued to present whatever version of the threat assessment served the current policy argument. The Corona program's secrecy was maintained in part through a procedure that required that intelligence derived from satellite imagery be protected in ways that concealed its source. If an intelligence report based on satellite photography was shared more widely, the report had to be written in a way that did not reveal that it had come from a satellite. This created a systematic problem. Decision-makers who read the intelligence but did not know its source might not understand its reliability or its limitations. The fiction of the source had to be maintained at multiple levels to prevent disclosure of the program itself. This is one of the less examined ways in which Cold War secrecy created internal distortions. The system for protecting secrets sometimes required providing inaccurate information about the nature of the intelligence, which complicated the ability of consumers of that intelligence to assess it properly. The intelligence community's management of what it knew and what it disclosed was not limited to technical intelligence. The human intelligence programs, which relied on agents and defectors within the Soviet system, also produced information that was selectively disclosed and selectively used. The defectors who provided information about Soviet capabilities and intentions were handled in ways that maximized the intelligence value of their information while minimizing the political complications of their disclosure. Some defectors were kept in highly restricted circumstances for years, their information extracted over extended periods, with little concern for the defectors' own well-being. The information they provided shaped American policy, justified procurement decisions, and informed military planning. But the defectors themselves were managed as intelligence assets rather than as individuals with rights and interests of their own. One of the most significant defectors of the Cold War era was Oleg Penkovsky, a Soviet military intelligence officer who provided American and British intelligence with information about Soviet missile capabilities in the period immediately before and during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Penkovsky's information, which confirmed that the Soviet missile arsenal was significantly smaller and less capable than American assessments had suggested, was an important input into Kennedy's decision-making during the crisis. It contributed to his assessment that Khrushchev was in a weaker position than his public statements implied. Penkovsky was eventually caught by Soviet counterintelligence, tried, and executed in 1963. The extent of his contribution to American and British intelligence was not publicly disclosed at the time. His role became better known over subsequent decades, but the full record of what he provided and how it was used remained partially classified for a considerable period. The management of intelligence about Soviet capabilities was complicated throughout the Cold War by an internal American debate about what the Soviet Union's actual strategic intentions were. One school of thought, which dominated American intelligence assessments for most of the Cold War, held that the Soviet Union was an expansionist power that intended to use its military capabilities offensively if given the opportunity, and that deterrence required maintaining military strength sufficient to make that opportunity prohibitively costly. Another school of thought held that the Soviet Union was primarily a defensive power whose military buildup was driven by historical experience of invasion and by a genuine concern about American intentions, and that the appropriate American response was not unlimited military competition, but negotiation and reciprocal restraint. This debate was not conducted publicly. It was conducted within classified channels, in internal assessments and policy papers that were not available to the public and that were sometimes not available to the senior officials who needed them most. The political consequences of the debate, which shaped everything from procurement decisions to arms control negotiations, were transmitted to the public through policy statements and budget requests that gave no indication of the uncertainty underlying them. The arms control negotiations that produced the various treaties of the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s were themselves processes that contained significant elements the public was not told about. The negotiations were, on both sides, conducted by officials who operated with classified information about their own capabilities and those of the adversary that was not shared with the other side and was not shared with the public. The treaties that emerged from these negotiations were evaluated publicly on the basis of their stated terms, without access to the classified assessments of how the terms were likely to be implemented and verified. In some cases, the classified assessments were considerably more pessimistic than the public statements made by the officials who had negotiated the treaties. The limitations on verification, the ambiguities in the treaty language, and the concerns about compliance that the intelligence community had identified were not communicated to the public in ways that would have allowed an informed evaluation of whether the treaties were actually achieving their stated purposes. The Saltai Agreement of 1972, which placed limits on the number of strategic offensive weapons that each side could deploy, is an example of this pattern. The agreement was presented publicly as a significant step toward arms control that would slow the growth of both sides' nuclear arsenals. The classified assessment of the agreement's likely effects was more complicated. The agreement allowed both sides to continue deploying multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, which meant that each missile could carry multiple warheads. Since the treaty counted missiles rather than warheads, both sides could, and did, significantly increase the actual number of nuclear warheads in their arsenals while nominally complying with the treaty's limits on missiles. This was understood by the negotiators on both sides. It was not explained to the public, which was left with the impression that the treaty was limiting nuclear weapons in a more comprehensive way than the classified record indicated. The broader history of Cold War arms control, when the classified record is eventually examined, reveals a systematic tension between the political need to demonstrate progress and the military and intelligence community's concerns about the strategic implications of any given agreement. This tension was resolved repeatedly by crafting agreements that were publicly presentable as significant achievements while preserving enough ambiguity and enough exclusions to satisfy the military establishments on both sides. The public was told that the Cold War was being managed. The classified record shows that it was being managed in ways that were often less systematic and less reassuring than the public statements suggested. The management of nuclear risk extended to the question of what would happen if deterrence failed. The civil defense programs that both superpowers maintained throughout the Cold War were premised on the assumption that some survivable outcome was possible following a large-scale nuclear exchange. This assumption was contested within the classified planning communities of both sides. The studies that examined what a large-scale nuclear exchange would actually produce concluded, in most cases, that the immediate effects of the explosions and radiation would be devastating in themselves, but that the longer-term effects, including the disruption of agriculture, supply chains, and medical systems, would extend the casualties and hardship significantly beyond the immediate blast zones. The most thorough American studies of these effects, conducted in the early 1980s and eventually declassified in part, concluded that a large-scale nuclear exchange would cause a collapse of agricultural production across much of the Northern Hemisphere due to the combined effects of dust, smoke, and radiation. This phenomenon, which became known as nuclear winter, was a scientific hypothesis with classified antecedents that predated the public scientific discussion of the concept by several years. The nuclear winter research, when it became public in the early 1980s through papers published by prominent scientists, was treated by some government officials as politically motivated. The Reagan administration, which was at that point engaged in a significant military buildup and was pursuing an aggressive nuclear posture, was not well served by research, suggesting that nuclear war would be catastrophic not only for the combatants, but for much of the rest of the world. The government's response was to fund studies intended to challenge the nuclear winter hypothesis and to question the credentials and motivations of the scientists who had advanced it. The classified government research on similar questions, which had reached conclusions that were in some respects consistent with the nuclear winter hypothesis, was not part of the public debate. Officials who had access to the classified studies and who participated in public disputes about nuclear winter were arguing in public about a scientific question while holding classified information that was relevant to the question, but that they were not in a position to disclose. The question of what nuclear war would actually do to human civilization was, in a sense, the central classified secret of the Cold War. Both governments had invested enormous resources in studying this question. Both had reached conclusions that were, in important respects, not reflected in their public statements about nuclear deterrence. The public doctrine of deterrence was premised on the notion that nuclear weapons were usable threats, that their deployment and targeting gave political leverage, and that their use, while catastrophic, was a conceivable outcome that could be managed through careful planning. The classified research on the actual effects of nuclear use pointed toward conclusions that undermined this premise. If a large-scale nuclear exchange would produce effects so severe that no meaningful recovery was possible, then the entire framework of deterrence, with its assumption that both sides were rationally weighing costs and benefits, was operating on false premises. This tension between the public deterrence framework and the classified understanding of nuclear war's effects was never resolved within the Cold War period. It was, to a significant degree, managed through compartmentalization. The people who managed the policy of deterrence and the people who studied the effects of nuclear use worked in different bureaucratic spaces, with different security clearances, and often with different institutional objectives. The deterrence managers needed nuclear weapons to function as credible threats. The effects researchers were producing information that complicated the credibility of those threats. The two communities coexisted within the same government classification system without their conclusions being systematically integrated. One of the more unusual aspects of the Cold War's classified history involves the extensive programs of psychological operations and influence activities that both sides conducted. The Soviet Union's Active Measures Program, which used intelligence assets to plant disinformation in Western media, to influence political movements, and to shape public opinion in target countries, was a systematic effort that operated for decades. The American response, which included its own programs of psychological operations, funding of cultural institutions, and support for anti-communist political movements in various countries, was also extensive and was conducted in ways that were not disclosed to the American public or to the legislative oversight bodies that were nominally responsible for overseeing intelligence activities. The Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was an international organization that supported writers, artists, and intellectuals in Western countries from the early 1950s onward, was later revealed to have been secretly funded by the Central Intelligence Agency. The organization published literary journals, organized international conferences, and supported artistic and intellectual work across multiple countries. Its participants, many of whom were genuinely anti-communist and would have found the connection uncomfortable, were generally unaware of the funding source. The revelation, which came in 1967 through investigative journalism, damaged the credibility of the cultural activities the organization had supported and created political complications for the intelligence community. The internal documents about the program, which have been partially declassified, reveal an organization that was consciously using cultural production as a tool of Cold War competition, funding work that its officers believed would be persuasive in the ongoing ideological struggle without disclosure to the participants or the public. The space programs of both the United States and the Soviet Union were, from their beginnings, entangled with military objectives that were not fully reflected in their public presentations. The American space program was publicly presented as a civilian enterprise conducted by the civilian agency NASA, in competition with the Soviet program for the achievement of scientific and technological milestones. The classified history of the American space program reveals a much more extensive military dimension. The reconnaissance satellites that constituted the Corona program and its successors were, in a formal sense, separate from NASA. But the technical knowledge, the launch infrastructure, and in some cases the personnel, were shared across the civilian and military programs in ways that blurred the distinction. The Soviet space program was even more thoroughly integrated with the military. Many of the vehicles that the Soviets used for civilian space activities were versions of military ballistic missiles. The cosmonauts who were publicly presented as scientific explorers were, in many cases, also military officers whose activities served military objectives that were not publicly disclosed. The competition in space was, at a technical level, a competition in ballistic missile technology. The rockets that could put a satellite in orbit could, with appropriate modifications, deliver a nuclear warhead to a target on the other side of the planet. The Soviets' launch of Sputnik in 1957 was understood by the American intelligence community primarily as a demonstration of Soviet ballistic missile capability, not as a scientific achievement. The public presentation of Sputnik as a scientific milestone and a Cold War propaganda victory emphasized the wrong aspect of the event. What Sputnik demonstrated technically was that the Soviet Union had a rocket capable of achieving orbital velocity, which meant it had a rocket capable of delivering a nuclear weapon to any point on Earth. The American public's anxiety about Sputnik was, from a military perspective, more appropriate than the scientific framing that was used to describe it, but the military implications were not the ones that government officials chose to emphasize in public. The American development of anti-satellite capabilities, which was conducted throughout the Cold War, was another area in which the public record significantly understated the actual activities. The classified programs for disabling or destroying Soviet satellites were developed in the 1950s and continued in various forms through the end of the Cold War. These programs were not publicly acknowledged because their existence would have created diplomatic complications and would have raised questions about the stability of the nuclear command and control systems that depended on satellites. If both sides knew that the other had anti-satellite capabilities, the stability of deterrence, which depended on both sides maintaining reliable command and control, was potentially undermined. The classified programs could be maintained precisely because neither side was required to disclose their existence, and the diplomatic consequences of disclosure were judged to outweigh whatever deterrent value might come from making them public. The question of stability, in the technical sense used by nuclear strategists, was one of the most extensively analyzed and least publicly discussed aspects of Cold War nuclear policy. Stability, in this usage, referred to the property of a nuclear balance in which neither side had an incentive to strike first, because the adversary's retaliatory capability was sufficient to deter a first strike, even if the first strike were as effective as possible. Maintaining stability required attention to a range of factors, including the survivability of each side's nuclear forces, the reliability of their command and control systems, the accuracy of their warning systems, and the credibility of their retaliatory threats. The analysis of stability was conducted within the classified planning community with considerable sophistication. The conclusions of that analysis were sometimes alarming. There were periods during the Cold War when the nuclear balance was, by the criteria used by the planners, less stable than the public was led to believe. The introduction of highly accurate land-based ballistic missiles in the 1970s created a specific stability problem that was extensively analyzed within the classified community. The problem was this: if both sides deployed large numbers of accurate land-based missiles, each side's missiles became vulnerable to a preemptive strike by the other side's missiles. The fear of being struck first created an incentive to strike first. This dynamic, which planners described as the stability problem of the land-based missile force, was discussed extensively within government. The proposed solutions, including deploying the missiles in ways that reduced their vulnerability or negotiating limits on the most accurate land-based missiles, were debated for years. The public was given partial information about these debates, enough to understand that something called the window of vulnerability was being discussed, but not enough to understand the full technical analysis that underlay the concern or the extent to which the analysis suggested that the nuclear balance was less stable than the doctrine of deterrence assumed. The management of nuclear risk during the Cold War was, in the end, a combination of deliberate policy, institutional inertia, and a considerable amount of chance. The deliberate policy was articulated in terms that were designed to be credible, but that concealed significant uncertainty. The institutional inertia was the accumulated weight of organizations, procurement programs, planning documents, and command structures that had developed over decades and that were difficult to change because of the political and institutional investments that had accumulated around them. And the chance was, simply, the sum of all the individual moments in which an accident did not happen. A sensor did not malfunction in a critical way. An officer did not follow an incorrect protocol. A warning was not misread as an attack. The near misses that have become publicly known, through declassification, through the accounts of participants, through the work of historians who have spent decades reconstructing events from partial records, represent only a fraction of the actual incidents that occurred. The classification system was not designed to eventually release everything. It was designed to protect information indefinitely, with the possibility of eventual release as an afterthought. The documents that have been released were released because of specific legal processes, specific political decisions, or specific administrative failures. The documents that have not been released remain classified. The near misses that have not been documented in any record that has become available remain unknown. The complete accounting of how many times the Cold War came close to a catastrophic outcome is not possible, because the complete record does not exist in any accessible form. What can be said with confidence is this: the public understanding of the Cold War as a period of managed tension, in which rational actors maintained a stable balance of terror through careful calculation, is significantly at odds with the classified record of the period. The classified record shows a period of repeated accidents, repeated near misses, repeated instances of systems failing to perform as designed, repeated instances of human judgment being exercised in ways that the systems were not designed to accommodate, and that produced outcomes the systems could not have guaranteed. The stability of the Cold War, to the extent that it can be called stable, was not the product of a reliable system designed to prevent catastrophe. It was the product of a series of improvisations, individual judgments, and accidents of timing that happened to produce an outcome in which the weapons were never used. The technical systems that sustained the Cold War's nuclear standoff were not retired when the Cold War ended. The warheads were not disassembled. The command structures were not dissolved. The targeting plans were updated, not abandoned. The early warning systems remained operational. The submarines carrying ballistic missiles continued their patrols. The land-based missiles remained in their silos, on a readiness status that has been modified, but not eliminated. The institutional cultures that had developed around the maintenance and potential use of these weapons survived the political changes of 1991, because those cultures were embedded in organizations whose core functions had not changed. The dead hand system, or its successors, has been described by Russian officials in terms suggesting it remains operational in some form. American strategic nuclear forces continue to maintain a portion of their weapons on alert status, ready to launch within minutes of an authorized command. The command structures that would manage the use of nuclear weapons continue to exist, continue to be exercised in classified simulations, and continue to be refined based on analysis that is not publicly available. The near-miss incidents that occurred during the Cold War were studied by planners on both sides, but the lessons that were drawn from them were incorporated into classified doctrine rather than into any publicly available framework for preventing future incidents of the same kind. The intelligence programs that produced the distortions and abuses of the Cold War era were reformed in ways that addressed some of their most publicly documented problems, but left intact the institutional structures that had produced those problems. The oversight frameworks that were established after the intelligence investigations of the 1970s created new legal constraints and new supervisory mechanisms. Those mechanisms have been repeatedly tested by subsequent administrations that found, within the frameworks, sufficient ambiguity to pursue activities that the framework's architects had not intended to authorize. The environmental contamination produced by the Cold War's nuclear weapons programs continues to require active management at multiple sites in the United States, Russia, the Marshall Islands, Kazakhstan, and other locations. The cleanup programs are ongoing and, at some sites, are expected to continue for generations. The health consequences of the contamination continue to affect the populations who were exposed. The communities that were used as the hidden costs of the Cold War's nuclear enterprise have not been made whole, because the scale of what was done to them was too large and too long-term for any compensation program to fully address. The Cold War ended in 1991 without a treaty that formally concluded it, without a peace agreement, and without any systematic accounting of what had occurred within its classified perimeters. The political framework that had organized the confrontation collapsed. The weapons and the institutions built to use them did not. The systems designed to launch nuclear weapons without requiring human judgment remained in their silos and their submarines, waiting for conditions that the end of the Cold War had made less likely, but had not made impossible. The files that documented the full extent of the near misses, the accidents, the environmental damage, the experiments on unwitting populations, and the automated systems standing in for human decision-making remained, in large part, classified. They continue to accumulate in archives that were not designed to be opened. The Cold War did not end. It was administratively concluded. The machinery it built is still running.